You think you know what evil looks like, don't you? You picture dark alleys, masked criminals, maybe some dictator screaming from a podium. But tonight, while you sit there in your comfortable ignorance, scrolling through your phone with that false sense of moral superiority, I'm going to show you something that will make your skin crawl. I'm going to show you how the most trusted institution in human history, the very organization that taught you about love, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek, became the most sophisticated torture machine the world has ever known. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a church bell the same way again. Picture this. It's 1252, and Pope Innocent IV just signed a document that would make modern war criminals weep with envy. The papal bull Ad Extirpanda sounds harmless enough, right? Like some gardening manual about removing weeds. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Except the weeds were human beings, and the removal process involved breaking every bone in their bodies while chanting hymns. But here's the beautiful irony that would make Satan himself applaud. They weren't doing this because they were evil. Oh no. They were doing it because they loved you so much they couldn't bear to see your soul burn in hell for eternity. Can you feel that twisted logic wrapping around your throat like rosary beads? Every scream torn from a heretic's lips was a prayer. Every joint dislocated by the strappado was an act of divine mercy. Let me paint you a picture that no history book will ever show you in full color. Imagine walking into the basement of a medieval monastery. The stone walls are damp with centuries of human terror, and the air tastes like iron and desperation. There's Brother Thomas, a man who spent his morning praying for the souls of all humanity, now carefully adjusting the ropes on the pulley system. His hands, the same hands that blessed bread and wine just hours earlier, are steady as a surgeon's as he prepares to lift a suspected heretic by his bound arms until his shoulders pop like wishbone. And the most disturbing part? Brother Thomas sleeps peacefully that night, because in his mind, in the mind of every torturer wearing a cross, he just performed the most loving act imaginable. He saved a soul. The screams echoing off those stone walls weren't the sounds of agony. They were the birth cries of redemption. You want to know how they justified it? How they looked at instruments of torture and saw tools of salvation? It's simpler than you think, and that's what makes it so terrifying. They created a theological framework so elegant, so perfectly constructed, that it could transform any atrocity into an act of love. They called it saving the soul by destroying the body. Like some cosmic chemotherapy, kill the disease by poisoning the patient. The logic was bulletproof. Your body is temporary, your soul is eternal. A few hours of earthly pain to avoid an eternity of hellfire? That's not cruelty, that's mathematics. Divine mathematics. They had it all figured out, written down in official documents, approved by men who wore golden hats and claimed to speak for God himself. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theological mind of his era, laid it out like a recipe for salvation soup. He wrote that heresy was worse than counterfeiting money because it corrupted souls instead of just coins. And what did you do with counterfeiters? You executed them, obviously. So heretics deserved even worse. The math was simple, the conclusion inevitable, and the methods were limited only by human imagination and the tensile strength of human joints. But here's where it gets really sick. They developed specialized techniques for different types of heretics, like a demonic menu at some restaurant in hell. Suspected of practicing witchcraft? We have the water torture, drowning you slowly while giving you multiple chances to confess and save your soul. Accused of denying transubstantiation? Try our famous strappado, hanging by your arms while we add weights to your feet until you remember that bread really can become flesh. And the bureaucracy. Oh, the beautiful, suffocating bureaucracy of it all. They kept meticulous records. Names, dates, confessions extracted, methods used, final outcomes, all filed away in Vatican archives like quarterly reports from some spiritual corporation. Each torn fingernail documented, each broken bone cataloged, each dying breath recorded for posterity. They turned torture into an art form with quality control. The Inquisitor's Manual, yes, that was a real thing, like some twisted instruction booklet that came with your torture chamber, laid out precise guidelines. How long to apply pressure before asking questions? How many times to repeat the process? When to stop before permanent damage? They needed live confessors, not martyrs. It was torture with a customer service protocol. And the genius of it all? They made the victims complicit in their own destruction. "This is for your own good," they whispered as they tightened the screws. "We're trying to save you." The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical. Imagine being told that your torturers love you more than anyone ever has, that they're risking their own salvation by staining their hands with your blood, all to keep your soul from eternal damnation. They even had a term for it. Relaxing prisoners to secular authorities. Sounds pleasant, doesn't it? Like sending someone to a spa, except relaxing meant handing them over to civil authorities for execution because the church couldn't technically kill anyone. Their hands had to stay clean while they orchestrated murder with the precision of a symphony conductor. The really insidious part? They made doubt itself a crime. Question any church doctrine? Torture? Suggest that maybe God's love doesn't require quite so much screaming? Torture. Wonder aloud if perhaps Jesus might not approve of ripping people's arms from their sockets. Congratulations, you just confessed to heresy. Time for your therapy session with the rack. And they had an answer for everything. But Jesus said to love your enemies. Oh, we do love them. That's why we're saving their souls. But what about thou shalt not kill? We're not killing, we're healing. The body dies, but the spirit lives forever in paradise instead of burning in hell. But what about mercy and forgiveness? This is mercy. This is forgiveness. We're forgiving them the eternal torment they deserve by giving them just a little temporal pain. They created a closed logical loop that could justify anything. Any act of cruelty became an act of love. Any torture became salvation. Any murder became mercy. It was theological alchemy, transmuting human suffering into divine gold. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. What should chill your blood as you sit there thinking you're so much more civilized than those medieval monsters? The system worked. It worked so well that it lasted for centuries. It worked so well that people lined up to accuse their neighbors. It worked so well that entire populations lived in terror of expressing any thought that might be construed as doubt. And the most beautiful, horrible irony of all, the church was right about one thing. They did save souls, just not in the way they intended. They saved the souls of future generations by showing us exactly what happens when absolute moral certainty meets absolute power. They created a cautionary tale written in blood and carved into human bones. Yet somehow, we keep forgetting the lesson. We keep finding new ways to torture people for their own good, new ways to destroy bodies to save souls, new ways to love people to death, different uniforms, different flags, different holy books, but the same ancient music of humans screaming for divine purposes. The Inquisition didn't end in 1834 when it was officially abolished. It just changed its name, updated its methods, and learned to smile while it worked. Because the real horror wasn't the torture chambers or the burning stakes. The real horror was the idea behind it all, that some people know what's best for your soul better than you do, and they're willing to destroy your body to prove it. So the next time you see someone claiming moral authority over others, claiming they know God's will, claiming they're hurting people for their own good, remember Brother Thomas adjusting those ropes in that basement. Remember the sound of shoulders dislocating in the name of love. Remember that the most dangerous people in history have always been the ones who truly believed they were saving the world. But this story of sacred torture and holy terror, it doesn't end with dusty history books and museum displays. It lives and breathes in every institution that claims moral authority over human souls. And next time you hear someone say they're hurting people for their own good, you'll hear the echo of medieval screams and remember how little we've really learned from our own horrifying past. You thought the last part was disturbing? That was just the appetizer. Now I'm going to show you how they built their machine of salvation, brick by bloody brick, prayer by twisted prayer. I'm going to take you inside the minds of the architects who designed hell on earth and convinced themselves they were building heaven. Close your eyes and imagine you're Cardinal Robert Bellarmine in 1616, sitting in your opulent Vatican office, quill in hand, writing the procedures that will determine who lives and who burns. The candlelight flickers across pages of Latin text that read like a user manual for destroying human beings. But here's the sick beauty of it. You're not writing instructions for murder. You're composing a symphony of salvation, each note a scream, each movement a broken bone, each crescendo a soul allegedly saved from eternal damnation. The Inquisition wasn't some chaotic explosion of religious violence. Oh no, that would have been merciful in its randomness. This was systematic. This was engineered. This was torture with a business plan, terror with quarterly reviews, and agony with performance metrics. They created the world's first bureaucracy of pain, complete with org charts written in blood. Let me walk you through their organizational structure, because understanding how they built this machine is crucial to recognizing it when it rises again, and it always rises again. At the top sat the Pope, God's alleged representative on earth, who never had to dirty his hands, but whose signature authorized every scream. Below him, the cardinals of the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition. Yes, that was the actual name. They couldn't even be bothered to hide their grandiosity behind euphemisms. Then came the local inquisitors, usually Dominican or Franciscan monks who'd spent years studying theology before transitioning into their new career as professional soul savers through body breaking. These weren't wild-eyed fanatics foaming at the mouth. These were educated men, scholars, philosophers, who could quote Augustine and Aquinas while calculating exactly how much weight to add to a victim's feet during the strappado. But the real genius of the system wasn't at the top. It was at the bottom. They created an entire network of informants, turning communities against themselves with the promise of spiritual rewards and the threat of spiritual punishment. Your neighbor, your baker, your own family members became potential agents of the Inquisition. They called them familiars. What a beautifully twisted name for people who betrayed their most familiar relationships for the promise of salvation. Imagine living in that world. Every word you spoke, every book you read, every prayer you whispered could be reported, analyzed, and used as evidence of heretical thinking. They created a society where thought itself became a crime and paranoia became a virtue. The most dangerous thing you could do was think independently. The second most dangerous thing was to stop thinking altogether, because that might be interpreted as spiritual laziness. They had categories for everything. Heretics were classified like specimens in some demonic taxonomy. Formal heretics who openly denied church doctrine, material heretics who unknowingly held wrong beliefs, occult heretics who kept their doubts hidden, negative heretics who refused to affirm specific doctrine. Each category had its own prescribed treatments, its own therapeutic tortures, its own salvation protocols, and the trials. The beautiful, choreographed theater of these trials would make Kafka weep with envy. The accused had no right to know their accusers, no right to legal representation, no presumption of innocence. The burden of proof wasn't on the prosecution. It was on the victim to prove their orthodoxy. And how do you prove a negative? How do you prove you've never had a heretical thought? The system was designed to make innocence impossible and confession inevitable. They even had a technical term for the moment when someone finally broke under torture: purification. Eyes, the screaming, the begging, the willingness to confess to anything just to make the pain stop. That wasn't defeat. That was purification. The moment your will shattered was the moment your soul was allegedly cleansed. They turned psychological collapse into a sacrament. But here's where the true artistry of evil reveals itself. They made the torture chambers into sacred spaces. The rooms where they broke bodies were consecrated like churches. They began each session with prayers, asking God to guide their hands as they applied the thumbscrews. They ended each session with more prayers, thanking the Almighty for revealing truth through agony. They turned torture into a religious ritual, complete with liturgy. The instruments themselves were blessed by priests before use. The rack, the wheel, the iron boot, the pair of anguish, all sanctified tools in the workshop of salvation. They even had special prayers for different types of torture. There was a specific blessing for the water torture, another for the strappado, yet another for the application of hot irons. They created a whole theological framework around the idea that God spoke through pain. And the confessions they extracted, pure literary art. They didn't just want you to admit guilt. They wanted you to tell a story that fit their preconceived narrative about how heresy worked, how the devil operated, how spiritual corruption spread through communities. They had confession templates, standardized formats for admitting to crimes against faith. Your agony had to follow their script, or it didn't count as genuine repentance. The psychological manipulation was more sophisticated than anything modern cults have dreamed up. They convinced victims that the torture was evidence of God's love. See how much the church cares about your soul? See how far we're willing to go to save you from damnation? If we didn't love you, we'd just let you burn in hell forever. This temporary pain is proof of our eternal love. They created something even more insidious than physical torture. They created spiritual gaslighting on an industrial scale. They convinced entire populations that their torturers were their saviors, that their destroyers were their protectors, that their murderers were their most loving spiritual guides. The mental contortions required to maintain that worldview would have impressed Orwell himself. And the paperwork. Oh, the beautiful, meticulous paperwork that documented every detail of every broken soul. They kept records that would make modern data analysts jealous. Names, dates, accusations, torture methods used, confessions extracted, final sentences imposed, all filed away in archives that still exist today, silent witnesses to centuries of systematic spiritual terrorism. They even had quality control measures. Senior inquisitors would review junior inquisitors' work, making sure the torture was applied correctly, the confessions properly extracted, the sentences appropriately harsh. They had performance evaluations for torturers. Imagine that annual review. Brother Francis showed excellent technique with the thumbscrews this year, but we'd like to see improvement in his strappado applications. Overall rating? Satisfactory for soul-saving purposes? The economic incentives were brilliant, too. The Inquisition was self-funding through confiscation of heretics' property. The more people they convicted, the more wealth flowed into church coffers. They created a business model where torture was profitable, where breaking people paid for itself. Financial incentives aligned perfectly with spiritual objectives. It was capitalism with a cross on top. But perhaps the most disturbing innovation was their development of psychological torture techniques that left no physical marks. They understood that breaking someone's mind was often more effective than breaking their body. Sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, psychological isolation, constant questioning, spiritual manipulation. They pioneered techniques that modern intelligence agencies still use today. They created entire fake trials just to break people psychologically. Mock executions where victims were taken to the stake but not actually burned, just to let them experience the full terror of death before being returned to their cells to contemplate their fate. They understood that the anticipation of torture was often worse than the torture itself. The family destruction was systematic too. They encouraged children to inform on parents, spouses to betray each other, friends to sacrifice friendships for the promise of spiritual rewards. They weaponized love itself, turning the deepest human bonds into tools of spiritual enforcement. The most intimate relationships became the most dangerous vulnerabilities. And when it was all over, when the confessions were extracted and the sentences carried out, they held public ceremonies to celebrate these victories over heresy. Auto da fe, act of faith, where the broken victims were paraded through streets as examples of the church's merciful love. The crowds cheered as people burned, convinced they were witnessing divine justice in action. The survivors carried psychological scars that lasted generations. Entire communities learned to live in terror of independent thought. The intellectual progress of humanity was set back centuries as people learned that curiosity was dangerous, that questions were heretical, that doubt was deadly. They didn't just torture individuals, they tortured human civilization itself. But here's the most terrifying part of all. The system worked exactly as designed. It created the most intellectually conformist society in human history. It eliminated dissent so effectively that for centuries barely anyone dared question church authority. The torture chambers were empty, not because the church became merciful, but because everyone learned to torture themselves preemptively, crushing their own doubts before they could be detected by others. The Inquisition created the perfect totalitarian state, centuries before the term was invented. They proved that if you can control people's relationship with the eternal, you can control everything else about their lives. They demonstrated that the most effective chains are the ones people forge for themselves out of fear and false love. And the institutional memory of how to build such systems never really disappeared. It just went underground, waiting for the right conditions to resurface with new names, new uniforms, new holy books, but the same ancient architecture of terror disguised as salvation. The blueprints for building hell on earth while calling it heaven are still there, still available, still being studied by those who dream of power over human souls. Next time you see someone building systems of control in the name of protecting people from themselves, remember these organizational charts written in blood. Remember how easy it is to convince people that their chains are actually wings, that their cages are actually sanctuaries, that their torturers are actually their most devoted lovers. Now comes the part that will really twist your stomach into knots. Because I'm about to introduce you to the heroes of this story, the men and women who didn't just participate in the system of sacred terror, but who perfected it, celebrated it, and were literally made saints for it. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Catholic Church looked at people who tortured others in the name of God and said, "These are our role models. These are the humans we should all aspire to become." Meet Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, a man so devoted to saving souls through suffering that his very name became synonymous with religious terror. But here's what your history books won't tell you. Torquemada genuinely believed he was the most loving man who ever lived. In his mind, every person he burned alive was a love letter to God. Every family he destroyed was a prayer for humanity's salvation. Picture him in his sparse cell, kneeling on cold stone floors, praying for hours before each day's work of spiritual purification. This wasn't some sadistic monster reveling in cruelty. This was a man who ate bread and water, wore rough cloth against his skin, and spent his nights in agonizing prayer, begging God to guide his hands as he signed death warrants. The most terrifying thing about Torquemada wasn't his cruelty. It was his absolute, unshakable certainty that he was performing acts of divine love. Under his guidance, the Spanish Inquisition perfected techniques that would make modern psychological warfare specialists take notes. They developed the auto da fe into a public spectacle that combined religious theater with mass psychological conditioning. Imagine Times Square on New Year's Eve, but instead of celebrating the future, they're celebrating the systematic destruction of human beings who dared to think differently. These weren't quick executions. Oh no, that would have been merciful. They were elaborate productions designed to maximize both the victim's suffering and the crowd's participation in that suffering. The condemned were dressed in San Benitos, special garments decorated with flames and demons, and paraded through streets while crowds threw stones and screamed religious slogans. The victims became living symbols of what happened to people who questioned authority. But Torquemada's true genius wasn't in the public spectacles. It was in the private innovations. He pioneered the use of family members as torture devices. Why break someone's bones when you could break their heart? They would bring in a suspect's children, spouse, or parents and torture them while the accused watched. The psychological damage was permanent and untreatable. They discovered that a parent would confess to anything, absolutely anything, to stop their child's screaming. And the children. Dear God, the children. The Inquisition developed special procedures for dealing with minors who showed signs of heretical thinking. They called it early intervention, catching spiritual corruption before it could fully take root. Children as young as 12 could be subjected to mild torture to help them understand the error of their ways. They convinced parents that allowing their children to be tortured was the ultimate act of parental love. Then there's Bernard Gui, the Dominican friar whose manual for inquisitors became the gold standard for spiritual terrorism. This wasn't just a how-to guide for torture. It was a comprehensive psychological profile of how heretical thinking developed, how to detect it in its earliest stages, and how to root it out completely. Guy understood that the most dangerous heretics weren't the obvious ones. They were the subtle ones, the ones who appeared orthodox while harboring secret doubts. His manual reads like a psychiatric textbook written by someone who wanted to destroy human psychology rather than understand it. He categorized different types of heretical personalities, developed specific interrogation techniques for each type, and created a systematic approach to breaking down psychological defenses. He understood that everyone had a breaking point, and he mapped out the most efficient routes to reach that point for different personality types. Gouy pioneered the technique of false mercy, pretending to be the victim's friend and protector while orchestrating their destruction. He would personally visit prisoners in their cells, bringing them small comforts, speaking gently about their families, offering hope for clemency. This wasn't kindness, it was psychological warfare designed to create emotional dependence that could be weaponized during interrogation. But perhaps the most disturbing figure is Peter of Verona, who was canonized as Saint Peter Martyr, specifically for his work as an inquisitor. The church looked at a man whose career was built on torture and murder and declared him worthy of sainthood. They created feast days to celebrate him, built churches in his honor, and encouraged the faithful to pray to him for guidance. Imagine praying to a saint whose specialty was breaking human beings in the name of God. Peter's innovation was the development of spiritual medicine. The idea that just as physical doctors sometimes had to cause pain to heal bodies, spiritual doctors had to cause pain to heal souls. He created detailed analogies between medical procedures and torture techniques. Pulling out fingernails was like extracting infected teeth. Breaking bones was like setting fractures. Burning flesh was like cauterizing wounds. He made torture sound therapeutic. He also pioneered the use of religious imagery during torture sessions. Crucifixes were placed where victims could see them, reminding them that Jesus suffered too. Religious music was played during interrogations. Bible verses about divine love were read aloud while thumb screws were tightened. The victims' last sensory experiences were designed to be religious ones, supposedly helping their souls transition to salvation even as their bodies were destroyed. The female inquisitors were perhaps even more terrifying because they added an extra layer of psychological manipulation. Women like Maria de Agreda used their perceived maternal instincts to create false intimacy with female prisoners. They would stroke victims' hair while explaining how much it hurt them to see such spiritual corruption. They turned motherly love into a weapon, creating confusion about whether they were being tortured or cared for. These women specialized in breaking other women by attacking their identities as mothers, wives, and daughters. They understood that female psychology often centered around relationships and caregiving, so they weaponized those very instincts. A woman might withstand physical torture, but few could withstand having their maternal love twisted into evidence of spiritual corruption. The theological justifications these saints developed were works of intellectual art. They created complex philosophical arguments, proving that love sometimes required violence, that mercy sometimes demanded cruelty, that salvation sometimes necessitated destruction. They weren't just torturing people. They were redefining the very concepts of love, mercy, and salvation to accommodate their actions. St. Robert Bellarmine, one of the most respected theologians in church history, wrote extensively about the necessity of physical coercion in spiritual matters. His arguments were so sophisticated that they're still studied in seminary schools today, not as examples of how wrong the church was, but as examples of rigorous theological thinking. The institution that claims moral authority over 1 billion souls still treats these torture manuals as serious theological scholarship. But here's the most stomach-churning part. These saints genuinely loved their victims. Not in spite of the torture, but because of it. They convinced themselves that inflicting maximum suffering on someone was the highest form of love possible. They created a twisted theology where causing pain became indistinguishable from showing affection. The more they hurt you, the more they loved you. The more you screamed, the more they cared. They developed rituals around this perverted love. Before each torture session, they would pray for their victims, asking God to help them show proper love through proper punishment. After each session, they would pray again, thanking God for allowing them to demonstrate such profound care for human souls. They turned torture into a sacrament of love. The psychological profiles that survive from this period show that many of these saints experienced genuine ecstasy during torture sessions. Not sexual pleasure, but spiritual rapture. They described feeling closer to God while breaking human beings than at any other time in their lives. They experienced torture as a form of prayer, suffering as a form of worship, screaming as a form of sacred music. And the most horrifying detail? They kept detailed spiritual diaries describing these experiences. These documents still exist in Vatican archives, preserved as examples of profound religious devotion. Hundreds of pages describing the spiritual highs experienced while destroying human lives, the religious ecstasy found in human agony, the divine love discovered through inflicting mortal terror. The canonization process for these figures involved examining their torture work as evidence of their holiness. The Church didn't overlook their careers as professional soul breakers. They celebrated those careers as proof of extraordinary devotion to God. The more people they tortured, the more saintly they appeared. The more families they destroyed, the more love they demonstrated. The more communities they terrorized, the more they were praised for their pastoral care. These saints created instruction manuals that were used for centuries across the Catholic world. Their techniques were exported to every continent where Catholic missionaries operated. The methods developed by these holy torturers were used to convert indigenous populations in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. The sainthood of these figures legitimized their methods for future generations of spiritual warriors. Even today, these figures are officially venerated by the Catholic Church. Their feast days are still celebrated. Their names are still invoked in prayers. Their methods are still studied in seminary schools as examples of dedicated pastoral care. The institution that created them has never officially repudiated their methods, only quietly stopped using them when secular authorities made them illegal. But the psychological techniques they developed didn't disappear. They evolved. Modern cult deprogramming, political indoctrination, and psychological warfare all trace their lineage back to these sainted torturers. The methods for breaking human will in the name of salvation have been refined and updated, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. And somewhere in those Vatican archives, in rooms most people will never see, the detailed records remain. Thousands of pages documenting exactly how to destroy human beings while convincing yourself you're saving them. Instruction manuals for turning love into torture, care into cruelty, salvation into suffering. All preserved as sacred texts, all treated as holy wisdom, all available for anyone who might want to build such systems again. The saints of suffering proved that humans can justify absolutely anything if they believe strongly enough in their own righteousness. They showed that the most dangerous people aren't those who know they're doing evil, but those who are absolutely convinced they're doing good. They demonstrated that sainthood and sadism can occupy the same human heart without contradiction. And every time someone claims moral authority to hurt people for their own good, these saints smile in their graves, knowing their work continues under new names with new methods, but the same ancient heart of twisted love. But now we descend into the deepest circle of this theological hell, the actual moments when flesh met flame, when bone met iron, when human souls were allegedly saved through the systematic destruction of human bodies. I'm going to take you inside those chambers where screaming became prayer, where agony became ecstasy, where the most profound violations of human dignity were performed as acts of divine worship. You think you've seen horror in movies? You think you understand what cruelty looks like? What I'm about to describe to you actually happened, in rooms blessed by priests, with instruments sanctified by holy water, performed by men who went to Mass every morning and confessed their sins every week. These weren't demons wearing human faces. These were humans who'd convinced themselves they were angels. Picture the basement of the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, the headquarters of the Roman Inquisition. The year is 1633. They're preparing to question Galileo Galilei about his dangerous idea that the earth moves around the sun. But Galileo won't actually be tortured. His age and reputation protect him. Instead, they'll use something far more psychologically devastating. They'll show him the instruments, explain exactly how they work, and let his imagination do the rest. This was called territorial torture. The threat of agony used is precisely as the agony itself. They discovered that many people's minds would break just from seeing the devices, understanding their purpose, and contemplating their application to their own bodies. The anticipation of pain often achieved what actual pain could not. Fear became their most refined instrument. But let's not stay with the famous cases. Let me take you into the anonymous chambers where nameless heretics experience the full creativity of holy terror. Picture Maria Santos, a young woman accused of secretly practicing Judaism in 1680s Spain. She's been in her cell for 3 months, fed just enough to keep her alive, allowed just enough sleep to prevent delirium, given just enough hope to make despair more crushing when it returns. They bring her to the chamber at dawn, when the human spirit is weakest. The room smells of old blood, fear sweat, and the peculiar metallic scent that clings to iron instruments designed for human destruction. Brother Miguel, her interrogator, has already said his morning prayers. He's asked God to guide his hands, to help him show proper love to this lost soul, to grant him the wisdom to apply just enough suffering to achieve salvation without causing unnecessary damage. The rack stands in the center of the room like an altar, which in their minds it essentially was. Every rope, every pulley, every wooden beam has been blessed for sacred use. Maria is stripped not for humiliation, though that's a useful side effect, but because clothing might interfere with the proper operation of the machinery. Her nakedness is clinical, surgical, spiritual. They're about to perform an operation on her soul, and they need clear access to her body to do it properly. Brother Miguel begins with questions delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. Do you believe that salvation comes through Christ alone, or do you secretly maintain that the old covenant remains valid? His voice is gentle, almost loving. This isn't interrogation, this is pastoral care with very sharp teeth. When Maria denies the accusations, Brother Miguel nods understandingly. Of course she denies them. The devil has taught her to lie convincingly. That's why God has provided these tools to cut through deception and reach truth. He signals to his assistants, and they begin stretching Maria's body on the rack with the methodical precision of craftsmen proud of their work. The first sensation isn't pain, it's pressure. A gradual pulling that starts uncomfortable and slowly transforms into agony. But the real torture isn't physical. It's the conversation that continues throughout. Brother Miguel keeps talking. his voice never changing, never betraying anger or sadistic pleasure. He explains what's happening to her body in medical terms, describes what will happen next, asks if she's ready to confess and end this unfortunate necessity. I can see you're in pain, my child. That pain is the sound of truth trying to escape from your soul. Don't fight it. Let it speak. Let it save you. His words are punctuated by the creaking of rope and wood, the small sounds of human joints approaching their breaking points. The assistants work with the focused attention of musicians tuning instruments, adjusting tension with tiny increments, monitoring her responses with professional interest. But here's the most disturbing part. They genuinely care about her well-being. When her breathing becomes too labored, they stop and let her recover. When her heart rate becomes dangerous, they pause the session and bring water. This isn't sadistic torture for its own sake. It's therapeutic torture designed to achieve specific psychological objectives while keeping the patient alive and functional. They've calculated exactly how much pain the human nervous system can process before shutting down. They understand the relationship between physical agony and psychological compliance. They know which pressure points create maximum sensation with minimum lasting damage. Centuries of experience have taught them the precise engineering of human suffering. Between sessions, Maria is returned to a cell that's been carefully designed to maximize psychological pressure. The walls are covered with religious imagery, paintings of saints experiencing martyrdom, crucifixes showing Christ's suffering, verses about the necessity of pain for spiritual growth. She can't look anywhere without being reminded that suffering is holy, that pain is purification, that her agony is proof of God's love. They feed her just enough to maintain strength for the next session, but not enough to feel fully human. The bread and water are served by monks who pray over each meal, blessing her sustenance and asking God to use it to nourish her body for the work of saving her soul. Even her basic biological needs become part of the theological framework of her destruction. The sleep deprivation is precisely calculated. They wake her at irregular intervals to ask single questions, creating a state of chronic mental exhaustion that makes resistance increasingly difficult. But they frame this as spiritual discipline, helping her focus on eternal matters rather than temporal comforts like rest. Her disorientation becomes evidence of spiritual awakening. The psychological techniques they employed were more sophisticated than anything modern interrogators have developed. They understood that breaking someone's sense of reality was more effective than breaking their bones. They would bring in false witnesses who tearfully described seeing her perform heretical acts. They would show her forged documents in her own handwriting confessing to crimes she'd never committed. They would play elaborate psychological games designed to make her doubt her own memories, her own perceptions, her own sanity. But the most devastating technique was the use of religious authority itself as a weapon. These men represented God on earth. When they told her that her suffering was evidence of divine love, who was she to argue? When they explained that her torture was actually a form of prayer, what theological expertise did she have to contradict them? They weaponized her own faith against her, using her belief in God to justify destroying her in God's name. The confessions they extracted were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They didn't just want admissions of guilt, they wanted detailed narratives that confirmed their pre-existing theories about how heresy worked. Maria had to describe not just what she'd done, but why she'd done it, how she'd been corrupted, who had helped her, what other heretical thoughts she'd entertained. Her confession had to tell a complete story that justified their actions and validated their worldview. And the most horrific detail? The confessions were often accurate. Not because the accusations were true, but because the torture was so effective at implanting false memories that victims genuinely came to believe they had done the things they confessed to. The psychological manipulation was so complete that it created actual false memories, false beliefs, false identities. They didn't just force people to lie, they forced people to believe their own lies. The public reading of these confessions at the auto da fe served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for the masses, validation for the inquisitors, and a warning to anyone who might harbor similar thoughts. But most importantly, it completed the psychological destruction of the victims by forcing them to participate in their own humiliation while convincing them it was actually their salvation. Maria Santos, if she survived her interrogation, would never be the same person who entered that chamber. Even if her body healed, her mind would carry permanent scars. She would have learned that reality was whatever authority figures said it was, that her own perceptions couldn't be trusted, that resistance was not just futile but evidence of spiritual corruption. She would have been transformed from a thinking human being into a compliant subject who automatically doubted her own thoughts. The records show that successful treatment by the Inquisition often resulted in victims who became more Catholic than the Pope himself. They would spend the rest of their lives in exaggerated displays of orthodoxy, desperately trying to prove their spiritual purity to authorities who had taught them that their natural thoughts were inherently corrupt. They became living advertisements for the effectiveness of theological terrorism. But the Inquisitors understood that the real audience for these chamber dramas wasn't the victims. It was the broader community. Every person who disappeared into those cells, every scream that echoed through monastery walls, every broken human being who emerged speaking in the approved theological vocabulary, sent a clear message. Think carefully, speak cautiously, believe correctly, or this could be you. The chambers weren't just places where individual souls were allegedly saved. They were laboratories where entire populations learned to save themselves by surrendering their capacity for independent thought. The real product manufactured in those rooms wasn't confessions or executions. It was compliance. Automatic, reflexive, unconscious compliance with religious authority. And the most beautiful, terrible irony, the system was so effective that it eventually made itself unnecessary. After generations of theological terrorism, people learned to terrorize themselves. They internalized the Inquisition, carrying their own interrogators in their heads, their own torture chambers in their hearts, their own executioners in their consciences. The external machinery of spiritual enforcement could be dismantled because the internal machinery had been permanently installed. People no longer needed to be threatened with torture because they had learned to torture themselves with doubt, guilt, and fear of spiritual inadequacy. The Inquisition's greatest achievement wasn't the bodies it broke. It was the minds it taught to break themselves. But those chambers, those blessed rooms where human dignity went to die in the name of divine love, they left architectural blueprints that are still being followed today. Different tools, different vocabularies, different uniforms, but the same fundamental design. A sacred space where authorized personnel use systematic suffering to restructure human consciousness in the name of salvation. And every time you hear someone say they're hurting people for their own good, every time you see someone claiming that resistance to authority is evidence of corruption, every time you witness someone using love as justification for violence, you're seeing those chambers rebuilt in new forms with updated equipment, but the same ancient purpose. Now we arrive at the most soul-crushing chapter of this nightmare. What happened to the children who grew up in this world where love meant torture, where salvation required suffering, where questioning anything could get your family burned alive? I'm about to show you how the Inquisition didn't just destroy individual lives. It rewired human psychology across entire generations, creating a species of human being that had been fundamentally altered at the deepest levels of consciousness. You think trauma ends with the traumatized? You think psychological damage stops at the individual? The Inquisition proved that terror could be inherited, passed down through families like genetic code, embedded in cultural DNA so deeply that it would influence human behavior for centuries after the last torture chamber closed. They created transgenerational trauma on an industrial scale, and the psychological mutations they produced are still walking among us today. Picture a child, let's call him Pablo, born in Salamanca in 1578. His earliest memories aren't of lullabies and bedtime stories. They're of his mother whispering prayers of Orthodox devotion while checking the doors and windows, making sure no one could overhear their private conversations. His first lesson in language wasn't the alphabet. It was learning which words were safe to say aloud and which thoughts could only exist in the deepest silence of his own mind. Pablo learns to walk on spiritual eggshells before he learns to walk on actual floors. Every question he asks is filtered through his parents' terror. Why is the sky blue? Becomes a theological minefield. Where do babies come from? Could be interpreted as questioning divine creation. Why do people burn in the town square? Is a question that could get the entire family investigated for harboring sympathies toward heretics. His parents love him desperately, but their love has been contaminated by systematic terror. Every hug comes with whispered warnings. Every kiss is accompanied by desperate prayers that he'll learn to think correctly. They teach him to pray not because they want him to connect with God, but because they're terrified of what will happen if he doesn't perform orthodoxy convincingly enough. The playground games children normally play, pretending to be different characters, exploring imaginary worlds, asking what-if questions, all become dangerous. Pablo learns that imagination itself is suspect, that creativity could be evidence of spiritual corruption, that curiosity is a form of pride that leads to damnation. His natural childhood wonder is systematically crushed by parents who genuinely believe they're protecting his soul. School becomes a psychological minefield. The teachers aren't just educators, they're imhaups. They're informants trained to detect signs of heretical thinking in children. Pablo learns that getting the wrong answer isn't just embarrassing, it could indicate that his family has been teaching him incorrect doctrine. Every mistake becomes potentially life-threatening. Every creative interpretation of a lesson could be evidence of dangerous, independent thinking. The most heartbreaking part? Pablo begins to police his own thoughts. By age 7, he's developed an internal inquisitor that monitors every idea before it reaches consciousness. He learns to crush doubts before they fully form, to redirect questions before they become dangerous, to feel guilty for natural curiosity that could endanger his family. He becomes his own torturer, preemptively breaking his own spirit to protect those he loves. His dreams become battlegrounds, where orthodox thoughts fight heretical impulses. He wakes up terrified that something he dreamed might be evidence of spiritual corruption. His unconscious mind, the last refuge of freedom, becomes another source of danger that needs constant monitoring. Even sleep offers no escape from the need for theological vigilance. The Inquisition understood that children were the key to permanent social transformation. They developed specific techniques for reshaping young minds, creating educational programs that weren't just about teaching correct doctrine. They were about fundamentally altering how human consciousness operated. They wanted to produce adults who literally couldn't think heretical thoughts, whose minds would automatically reject any idea that contradicted church teaching. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents, not as betrayal, but as the highest form of love, saving their families' souls by exposing spiritual corruption before it could spread. Little Pablo learns that the most loving thing he can do for his parents is to report any suspicious conversations, any questionable books, any moments when they seem to doubt church authority. Love becomes indistinguishable from surveillance. The psychological techniques they used on children were more sophisticated than their adult methods because young minds were more malleable. They understood that trauma experienced before age 7 would become foundational to personality development. They deliberately created specific traumas, designed to produce specific types of adult compliance. Children who showed signs of intellectual curiosity were subjected to spiritual correction that involved public humiliation, designed to create lifelong associations between questioning and shame. Bright children learned that their intelligence was dangerous, that thinking too much was evidence of pride, that the safest response to any question was, "I don't know," but the church teaches. They created elaborate rituals around the concept of innocent faith, the idea that the most beautiful form of belief was unthinking, unquestioning acceptance of authority. Children were taught that doubt was not just wrong, but literally evil, that questions were temptations from the devil, that the highest spiritual achievement was the complete surrender of independent thought. Pablo grows up in a world where the most dangerous thing you can say is, "I don't understand." Confusion becomes evidence of spiritual inadequacy. Uncertainty becomes proof of insufficient faith. The natural learning process of childhood, asking questions, testing boundaries, exploring possibilities, becomes a catalog of potential heresies. The fairy tales and folk stories that normally help children process fears and develop resilience are replaced with hagiographies of saints who achieved holiness through suffering, stories of children who saved their families by exposing heretical relatives, cautionary tales about what happens to boys and girls who ask too many questions. Pablo's imagination is colonized by narratives of holy submission and sanctified self-destruction. His sexuality becomes another battleground. Normal adolescent curiosity about bodies and relationships becomes evidence of corruption that needs immediate spiritual intervention. He learns that his own physical development is suspicious, that sexual thoughts are demonic intrusions, that the safest approach to his own body is fear and shame. The Inquisition didn't just control what people could think, they controlled what people could feel about their own flesh. The marriage customs in Inquisition territories evolved to prioritize theological compatibility over emotional connection. Pablo will grow up to marry not someone he loves, but someone whose orthodoxy is sufficiently documented to protect both families from suspicion. Love becomes a luxury that faithful Catholics cannot afford. Passion becomes evidence of spiritual immaturity. The deepest human bonds are sacrificed on the altar of theological safety. But here's the most devastating psychological effect. Pablo and children like him develop what we might now recognize as spiritual Stockholm Syndrome. They genuinely fall in love with the system that terrorizes them. They experience gratitude toward the authorities who crush their natural development. They feel protective of the institution that taught them to fear their own minds. The Inquisition becomes not just their oppressor, but their identity. These children grow up to become adults who can't imagine life without constant surveillance, who feel lost without external authorities telling them what to think, who experience freedom as terror rather than liberation. They become parents who genuinely believe that crushing their own children's spirits is the most loving thing they can do. The cycle perpetuates itself through generations of traumatized love. The Inquisition created what might be history's most successful program of mass psychological conditioning. They proved that human nature itself could be fundamentally altered through systematic childhood trauma applied across entire populations. They demonstrated that free will could be eliminated, not through individual coercion, but through generational programming. Pablo represents millions of children whose psychological development was deliberately distorted to serve institutional control. He grows up to become an adult who experiences independent thought as physical pain, who feels guilty for any emotion that hasn't been approved by religious authority, who genuinely believes that his own mind is his greatest enemy. The records show that many adults who grew up during peak Inquisition periods developed what we might now recognize as complex PTSD, not from direct trauma, but from living in a state of constant hypervigilance about their own thoughts and feelings. They exhibited symptoms of learned helplessness, emotional numbing, and chronic dissociation from their own inner experiences. These psychological patterns didn't disappear when the Inquisition ended. They became embedded in cultural norms, family structures, and social expectations. The children who grew up terrorized by the possibility of spiritual inadequacy became parents who terrorized their own children with the same fears. The trauma metastasized across generations, creating populations of people who had been systematically trained to fear their own consciousness. The most tragic irony? Many of these generationally traumatized individuals became the most fervent defenders of the system that had destroyed their capacity for psychological freedom. They genuinely believed that the crushing of human spirit was evidence of divine love, that the elimination of independent thought was a form of salvation, that the transformation of children into frightened compliance machines was the highest achievement of Christian civilization. And the institutional memory of how to create such populations never fully disappeared. The techniques for producing generational trauma, for rewiring human psychology through systematic childhood conditioning, for creating adults who fear their own minds, all of this knowledge was preserved, studied, and adapted for use by later systems of control. Today, when we see populations that seem inexplicably willing to surrender their freedoms, that appear to genuinely love their oppressors, that demonstrate bizarre loyalty to systems that obviously harm them, we're looking at the descendants of Pablo and children like him. We're seeing the long-term effects of systematic psychological conditioning that was so effective it became self-perpetuating across centuries. The Inquisition's most lasting achievement wasn't the heretics it burned or the books it banned. It was the transformation of human consciousness itself. It proved that love could be weaponized, that childhood could be militarized, that the deepest bonds between parents and children could be turned into instruments of social control. And every time we see systems that claim to protect children by teaching them to fear their own thoughts, every time we witness institutions that use parental love as a tool of ideological enforcement, every time we observe the creation of populations that seem psychologically incapable of questioning authority, we're seeing Pablo's children still walking among us, still carrying the psychological scars of humanity's most successful experiment in the systematic destruction of human consciousness. And now we reach the end of this journey through the darkest chambers of human history, but here's the thing that should make your blood freeze in your veins. This story doesn't end. It never ended. What I've been describing to you isn't ancient history safely buried in dusty archives. It's a blueprint that keeps getting rediscovered, refined, and redeployed by every generation that decides it knows what's best for human souls. You want to know the most terrifying truth about the Inquisition? It worked. It worked so perfectly that its methods have become the template for every totalitarian system since. The technological delivery mechanisms have evolved. Instead of monks with thumbscrews, we have algorithms with psychological profiles, but the fundamental architecture remains unchanged. Find people's deepest fears about their own inadequacy, weaponize their love for their families, and convince them that surrendering their capacity to think independently is actually a form of liberation. Look around you right now, in this moment, as you sit there thinking you're so much more enlightened than those medieval monsters. Do you see the new inquisitors walking among us, wearing different uniforms but carrying the same ancient certainty that they know what's best for your soul? They don't call it heresy anymore. They call it misinformation, extremism, unhealthy thinking, conspiracy theories. But the underlying logic is identical. Some thoughts are too dangerous to be allowed. Some questions are too threatening to be asked. Some people are too corrupted by wrong ideas to be trusted with their own minds. The modern inheritors of Torquemada's legacy have learned to be more subtle, more psychological, more systemically embedded. They don't need torture chambers and monastery basements because they've figured out how to turn the entire information ecosystem into one giant strappado that stretches human consciousness until it snaps into compliance. They don't need to burn books because they can make dangerous ideas algorithmically invisible, disappeared not through fire but through digital manipulation that makes forbidden knowledge simply cease to exist in searchable reality. But here's what makes the modern version even more insidious than its medieval predecessor. Today's inquisitors have convinced their victims that the censorship is self-imposed, that the thought control is voluntary, that the psychological manipulation is actually personal choice. They've created systems so sophisticated that people torture themselves and call it self-care, surrender their intellectual freedom and call it responsible citizenship, police their own thoughts and call it mental health. The children of fear that the original Inquisition created have grown up to build digital panopticons that would make Brother Miguel weep with envy. Every click monitored, every search recorded, every social connection mapped and analyzed for signs of ideological deviation. But the genius of the modern system is that people carry their own surveillance devices willingly, even lovingly, checking them compulsively like rosary beads, seeking constant validation from algorithmic authorities that have replaced priestly ones. The pharmaceutical industry has perfected what the medieval torturers could only dream of, chemical compounds that can alter human consciousness directly, eliminating inconvenient thoughts and uncomfortable emotions without leaving visible marks. Depression, anxiety, and spiritual unrest, all the psychological states that might lead someone to question systemic authority, can now be medicated away. The rack and the wheel have been replaced by SSRIs and benzodiazepines, but the goal remains the same, producing compliant populations that experience psychological submission as wellness. Educational systems have evolved beyond the wildest dreams of medieval indoctrinators. Instead of simply teaching children what to think, modern pedagogical techniques teach them how to think, or more precisely, how not to think. Critical thinking has been redefined to mean accepting expert authority. Independent research has been reframed as dangerous self-deception. The natural curiosity that the Inquisition had to crush through violence is now eliminated through sophisticated psychological conditioning that makes children believe intellectual conformity is actually intellectual sophistication. The therapeutic culture has created a new class of secular priests who claim authority over human, psychological, and spiritual well-being. These modern confessors don't wear religious robes, but they exercise the same power to define which thoughts are healthy and which are pathological, which emotions are appropriate and which require intervention, which behaviors indicate wellness, and which indicate the need for correction. The language has changed, but the dynamic of spiritual authority over individual consciousness remains identical. Social media platforms have become the new auto da fe, public spaces where ideological deviants are ritually humiliated, their reputations destroyed, their livelihoods eliminated, all while crowds of digital spectators cheer for the purity of the community. The burning stakes have been replaced by viral shaming campaigns, but the psychological effect is the same, terrorizing populations into intellectual conformity through the public destruction of those who dare to think differently. Corporate human resources departments have evolved into secular Inquisition tribunals, complete with anonymous reporting systems that would make medieval informants proud. Employees learn to monitor their own speech, police their own thoughts, and report colleagues for ideological violations. The workplace becomes a space of constant theological vigilance where the wrong joke, the wrong question, or the wrong facial expression during a diversity training session can result in professional excommunication. Mental health diagnostics have created new categories of heresy disguised as medical conditions. Oppositional defiant disorder pathologizes the refusal to submit to authority. Social anxiety disorder medicalizes the normal human response to living under constant surveillance. Conspiracy thinking is treated as a mental illness rather than a natural response to living in a world where powerful institutions routinely lie about their activities and motivations. The beauty of these modern systems is that they've solved the Inquisition's biggest problem. They've eliminated the need for obvious coercion by making submission appear voluntary. People choose to surrender their privacy for convenience. They choose to medicate away their capacity for existential questioning. They choose to send their children to institutions that will systematically eliminate their ability to think independently. They choose to participate in digital systems that monitor and manipulate their behavior. The chains are invisible and the prisoners believe they're free, but perhaps the most brilliant innovation of the modern Inquisition is how it's convinced people that resistance to its authority is evidence of psychological or moral pathology. Question the official narrative about any significant event? You must have a mental illness. Express concerns about systematic censorship? You must be a dangerous extremist. Wonder about the long-term effects of unprecedented social engineering? You must be a conspiracy theorist. The modern inquisitors have made skepticism itself a form of heresy that requires therapeutic intervention. The pharmaceutical companies that profit from medicating away inconvenient consciousness, the tech platforms that profit from algorithmic behavioral modification, the educational institutions that profit from producing compliant graduates, the therapeutic establishments that profit from pathologizing normal human responses to abnormal circumstances. They've all learned from the Inquisition's mistake. Instead of making their control obvious and therefore resistible, they've made it invisible and therefore inescapable. And just like their medieval predecessors, these modern inquisitors genuinely believe they're saving souls. They're convinced that eliminating dangerous thoughts protects people from psychological harm. They're certain that medicating away existential anxiety promotes mental health. They're positive that censoring misinformation prevents social violence. They're absolutely sure that monitoring and manipulating human behavior creates safer communities. Their motives are pure, their intentions benevolent, their certainty complete, which makes them infinitely more dangerous than any medieval torturer who at least knew he was causing pain. The most horrifying realization is that this cycle appears to be eternal. Every generation discovers new ways to perfect the ancient dream of controlling human consciousness in the name of protecting human well-being. The technologies evolve, the vocabularies update, the uniforms change, but the fundamental project remains constant: the systematic elimination of humanity's capacity for independent thought, disguised as humanity's salvation from its own dangerous nature. Pablo's children are everywhere now, walking among us with their internally installed sensors, their chemically managed emotions, their algorithmically curated thoughts. They experience psychological freedom as anxiety, intellectual independence as irresponsibility, spiritual questioning as mental illness. They've been so successfully conditioned that they police not only their own consciousness, but everyone else's, serving as unpaid agents of systems they don't even recognize as systems of control. The Inquisition never ended. It just learned to hide better, to work more subtly, to embed itself so thoroughly in the fabric of civilization that questioning it becomes literally unthinkable for most people. The torture chambers still exist, but now they're inside our own minds, operated by our own hands, maintained by our own choices, justified by our own supposedly sophisticated understanding of what's best for human consciousness. And the most beautiful, horrible irony of all, by showing you this pattern, by helping you recognize these mechanisms, I've probably triggered your own internal inquisitor. Part of you is already wondering if seeing these connections means you're becoming one of those dangerous conspiracy theorists, if questioning these systems indicates some kind of psychological pathology, if thinking these thoughts proves you need therapeutic intervention. That voice in your head, that familiar whisper telling you to stop thinking dangerous thoughts, to submit to expert authority, to trust the systems that know better than you do, that's Brother Miguel, still working after all these centuries. Still convinced he's saving your soul by destroying your capacity to question the very authorities who claim ownership over that soul. But now you know. Now you can never unknow. Now you understand that the price of consciousness is eternal vigilance not just against external oppressors, but against the internal inquisitors that every system of control installs in human minds. The question isn't whether you'll resist. The question is whether you'll even recognize there's something to resist. The Inquisition's greatest victory wasn't the heretics it burned or the books it banned. It was teaching humanity to burn its own heretical thoughts, to ban its own dangerous questions, to torture its own consciousness in the name of spiritual safety. And until we learn to recognize and dismantle our own internal torture chambers, until we develop the courage to think thoughts that authority figures have declared unthinkable, until we reclaim our right to question everything, including our own questioning, the Inquisition will continue its eternal work of saving souls by destroying the humans who possess them.